Shalom Aleichem. This is Rabbi Moshe TORAH with Ways of Israel. This transmission is being done in English for the English community, and also because this has been placed upon my heart for some time now. And one of the things that we always fight with is the issue of unity within the community of Israel. And it's such a precise moment in history where we need to really reach out and be literally one. We need to understand that this is a message that comes from many thousands of years from King Solomon. In Mishle, or Proverbs, we read the words of King Solomon that says, "He that separates himself seeks his own desire, and snarls against all sound wisdom." The moral of this verse is not so certain according to some commentaries, but Rashi applies it to a man who separates himself from God to rebel against the laws of wisdom, and in actuality, I would even say the laws of mankind. Ibn Ezra, to one who leaves his family in search of wisdom. It's best to interpret this sentence as an anticipation of Hillel's aphorism, "Separate not thyself from thy community." In Proverbs 2, verse 5. Separate himself from adopting the will of the majority among whom he lives. In other words, according to Sadia Gaon and Ibn Nachamiash, the idea of to be separate if you do not agree with the majority of opinion is a sign of a rebel. So here we have something very interesting, because the Torah, or the words of wisdom, the Tanakh, is giving us an instruction from our sages that we are not to separate ourselves and be distinguished from among the rest. Rather, we should always seek to work within what is finally considered the consensus and the opinion of the majority. Now, those who understand this wisdom, this even applies in today's modern era, which means that if the majority of our leaders decides to go one way and a person decides to go the other, that person who decides to go other will be viewed as a rebel, not only against KLAL Israel, but also against God himself. And this is why Hillel says that this same verse, that he who mentioned the above, by saying this, he saying we're interrupted in order of the Nesim, who were descendants of the princes, to be completed. Now the other sayings of Hillel that we find here in Pirkei Avot are introduced in order to place them right next to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was his disciple. This is according to Rabbi Duran. Do not withdraw from the community. Instead, share in their burdens imposed by the government upon the oppression, in their fasts and their prayers. This is how we learn from Mordecai, who sent Esther, "Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape the king's house, more than all the Jews. For if thou hast behold the peace at this time, then will relief and deliverance will rise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house will perish." Esther chapter 4, verse 13 through 14. Now we've learned in the Talmud in Ta'anit 11a that if one withdraws from the community, there are two malachim who accompanies a person. They lay their hands on his head and say, "May so-and-so and so-and-so who withdrew from the community not be witness to the comfort of the community." A man should not entertain views far different from those of his community. But if he sees that the opinions of the people of the cities hold corrupt, and he is worried lest it concurs with them that it might adopt their course, walk in their evil ways, and thus be driven from a far way of life, then he must leave their midst immediately and go into another city, conduct of whose inhabitants is proper, and whose views are the right views with the principle of this same via media. If he has found no such city close to him, let him go to one that's far off. If he has found no such city, let him go to the wilderness, where there are no human beings. As Yirmiyahu says, and may he rest in peace, "Oh, that I were in the wilderness, in a lodging place of wayfaring men." This it says in Jeremiah 9, verse 1. In other words, if you cannot be part of the harmony of the community, you need to disappear into the wilderness and that your voice not be heard. This is basically what we're saying here. Praying together with a congregation is more praiseworthy than praying by oneself. For when a man prays by himself, he might conclude or include in his prayer some petition which could be detrimental either to another individual or to the public. Whereas when the congregation is at prayer, says Rabbi Duran, it is asked for those things which are of benefit to everybody. Moreover, by the way of parable in a bundle of needs, each single reed is weak and easy breakable. But as part of a bundle, the person is unable to break. And again, Pirkei Avot says, put not thy trust in thyself until the day of death. A person who separates himself has placed his trust in himself and not in God, and not in the community in which he or she supposedly says he belongs to. So when a person says he belongs to KLAL Yisrael and separates himself from KLAL Yisrael, there is a major sign of trouble. This is a sign of a rebel against God and against God's people. Let no man say, I may allow myself to ignore what has been forbidden by special decree as an added precaution, because I'm very careful not to fall into transgression. For lo, John Hyrcanus served 80 years as a high priest, and even became a Sadducee. And even a better example, and by that they mean a heretic. And even a better example, there are 3 commandments recorded in the Torah for which Scripture supplies reasons. Let not the king multiply horses to himself, neither shall he multiply wives to himself. But his heart turn not away, neither be greatly multiplied to himself silver and gold. That's in Devarim or Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 16 through 17. Solomon, however, had confidence in his own wisdom and depended on his own prudence and determined to ignore the commandments because he was certain that he would not be guilty of defection despite such indulgence, and in the end he was. This is the reason why for the commandments of the Torah has not been disclosed. Even when by some virtue has become second nature to a man, let him not neglect the opportunity for doing good again and again in order to fix the virtues more firmly in his soul, and let him not be overconfident to say, this virtue that I have already mastered successfully, it can never leave me. There's always a possibility that it may. Maimonides. Beware in your old age, as in your youth, not to expose yourself to the possibility of sinning by being self-confident. I would call it being cocky, self-reliant, need of nobody. Regarding yourself to secure in your purity as to be beyond reach of temptation. Rabbi Duran says something very interesting. It seems to me that this saying has been put to the one about not withdrawn from the congregation to teach you that it's much better for you to be part of the congregation, of the community, than to go off by yourself even for one day, even if you are well on in years. For when a person lives solitary, his evil impulses overpowers him through sinful thoughts from which no man is ever safe. As a result, he may come to an evil end, and in the company of others he escapes such evils. Do not judge thy comrade or thy fellow until thou hast stood in his place. As part of this whole entire concept is the concept that a person who withdraws himself from others, from others in the community, he surrounds himself of being snarled by the sound of wisdom. It sounds good to him or her. It sounds like, I am more holier than thou because I've got the truth, but you do not. This is a self-deceiving mechanism that a person finds himself when he withdraws himself from the community. Why am I putting so much emphasis to this? Because these are signs of when a person is beginning to rebel against God and against God's people. In a discussion, in a conversation that I had not too long ago with a couple of rabbis from New York, we were talking about the same concept, how people feel somehow exclusive in their absolute truism. And in so doing, they downplay every single other rabbi, or we would say in the secular world, diss them. In other words, discount their opinions, discount their fellowship, discount their ability to be part of a positive and constructive conversation. Such attitude is repugnant within the view of Torah Judaism. So one of the things that I'm making this video in particular for, to address this concept that I can create my own form of Judaism completely disconnected from all of Judaism. This is a major problem in which will lead the person off the derrick, the true derrick of Torah derrick. And how are we to respond to such person after admonishing such a person to stay within and to walk in peace and to walk within the harmony of the community? Let him be isolated. Let him go to the wilderness. Let him go and be separated from among all of Israel. He will not eventually be counted as part of KLAL Israel. Which brings me to another point that I want to address. This concept of a replacement of KLAL Israel. There are some on the internet who are discussing the idea of a rebelliousness against all Jews. In other words, there's actually a true hatred that's being expressed in very subtle words, that the natural Jew is not worth anything. Literally, that basically they should do away, eliminate them, annihilate them. In words that would cause anyone to remember the pictures of what took place thousands of years by the words of anti-Semitism, and which is an incorrect expression, anti-Jewishness in our past years that provoked and caused terrible crimes of humanity. Nevertheless, all of these things only depict this issue of persons that were hurt and had withdrawn themselves from the general community of Israel to be people who became rodef and Mosar, informers against our own people, and people who had a reason to go against and attack the Jewish people because they were hurt, they were offended, they felt that they were done a raw deal. And this is when we need to learn the concept of actus, when it really counts. Actus does not mean I am going to give up on my convictions or in my concepts of what I understand within the halakhic purview of Judaism. But I am not going to withdraw from the Jewish community by which I am a member of. Rather, I will remain there and attempt to influence the opinions and influence and change and affect what is happening. In other words, we are not to withdraw ourselves in a little cocoon and declare war against KLAL Israel, declare war against the establishments of the rabbis, which is actually completely contrary to the opinion. In reality, our condition spiritually in the Jewish community is one that we need more strength of unity and more strength from Torah values than ever before. So declaring a war against the rabbis or the rabbinate, or declaring a war against the Jewish people because a person may feel, well, this person is not Jewish, are other examples of signs of the person who's rebelling, withdrawing from God and God's people. And this is why we're told, do not judge thy fellow man until thou hast stood in his place. Even if your fellow man has been guilty of transgression, do not condemn him, saying, he deserves to be burned. He deserves to be stoned. The whole entire Jewish people, as it were, deserves to be strangled or killed because they're guilty of sin. This attitude is connected to the previous one of separating oneself from the community. If it happened with your fellow man that he did not withstand the temptation, do not disgrace him, saying instead, what he did is nothing. For it is possible that had the circumstance befallen you, you would have not been able to withstand the temptations and the troubles and the difficulties. In other words, this attitude is a lack of comprehension, a lack of compassion and understanding of your fellow man, which means that you are judging the person based upon your criterias, and those criterias are not necessarily correct. This is of a piece with statements that a man is not to trust in himself and to be sure of his own judgment. If a person sees that a companion of his is in high office and does not behave justly or correctly, let him not say, well, if I occupied his position, I would not do anything evil thing that he does. I'm not going to do the same thing he does. You don't know that. Human beings, one's no better than the other. In fact, we are all susceptible to the same follies. And when you have won and reached this position in the station, revealed a better nature, then you may question his ways, says Rabbi Jonah. Some of my teachers interpret this by saying to me as follows. If you may have met some stranger in the city and you find him fastidious in conduct and full of extraordinary virtues, do not conclude on your own that these constitute his real nature until you get to the place where he dwells and note his behavior there. It is like his behavior here. Then you will be in a position to judge him. Many are the cheap and mediocre individuals who show their true colors in one place and elsewhere puts on a show of saintliness which is not native to them. In other words, don't be deceived by the religious appearance or tenor that a person may show in person. That may not be the real self. The real self could be full of hatred, of envy, of hurt, and as a result, it's indicated within this concept of withdrawing himself or herself from others who are part of KLAL Israel. Say not of a thing which cannot be understood, that in the end it will be understood. And do not say there is something it will be possible to hear, and in the end it will be heard. If you are not engaged in some task, it's possible for you to listen to the words of Torah now. Even if there will be an opportunity to listen to them at some time, do not say, well, lo, there will be other opportunities for such a session, and then I'll go and attend. For you do not know what the day may bring, whether you will be able to attend again or not. Indeed, even if you are engaged in the task, take some time and study Torah, because it is in fact Torah. And when you study Torah, not by yourself necessarily, but it's always engaging with others, so that your opinion can be challenged by others. But also your motives. Why are you doing what you're doing? And here we go back into the words of Shlomo HaMelech, of Rabbi Hillel, and our sages, that we are not to separate ourselves from the community, because he that separates himself seeks his own desire. It's not the desire of the community. It's not the desire of KLAL Israel. It's not the desire of what is right. And here we go into my third point. My third point is there is a war as a result of the issues of conversions, of trying to help people who have been hurt, harmed, and affected. And those who have been involved have tried to declare war against the establishment and making it completely almost like a holy war. First of all, my organization, Los Caminos de Israel, Ways of Israel, we are opposed to this approach completely. We are one people, Israel, with all of the effects and all of the problems that we have. Just like there's a saying in Spanish that goes, mi vino es amargo, pero es mi vino. My wine is bitter, but it's my wine. We are a difficult people, but we are one people. And it is this one people that when a person converts has to be integrated with, either the proper way or through a standardization way. And unfortunately, a lot of difficulties has been placed in obstacles on the ways of sincere converts. But those who were converted and have been hurt by the process and who are now have isolated themselves from the community are risking themselves to be defined as an Amalek, an enemy of the Jewish people, even though they're part of the Jewish people. This is something, a new innovation. And I want to say this because there's a concept that's going around that is very similar, l'chavdil, of the church world, of what they call replacement theology. What do I mean by replacement theology? As we know, in the church world, they tried to say that there were the true Israel. And they were now replacing what was the old Israel, the old Jews, and thus establishing a new Jew. This concept is not new. It's the basis of many anti-Semitic and anti-Jewish pogroms in our history. But now we have something very similar taking place. If they don't accept me or us, we were going to go ahead and establish a new Israel with new converts based on the same parallel halakhic formulas that the other rabbis have established. But we will not recognize them. They don't recognize us. This is the very essence of disunity and separateness that takes a person out of this world. We may not like the things that have been dealt to us or the conditions of which the conversion world exists, but we must work within the system and not separate ourselves and think that we can create a brand new system that will triumph by conquering the world for Judaism. This approach has in it a very major flaw. And the flaw is what I just read from Mishle, that he that separates himself seeks his own desire, which means his own engrandurement, his own greatness, his own centeredness. And my friends, Ways of Israel, Los Caminos de Israel, is not part of this. We must work for and strive to work together in unity and achdus, even though there are things that we may not be individually in agreement. But when we do this, we deny our self in light of the greater good and the greater benefit, which is KLAL Israel and our connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I do hope that these words would have inspired you to make it very clear that we are to stay away from persons or organizations that try to imbibe people with this hatred that comes from the very depth and expressed as a rebelliousness, like we saw with Korach, and like we see with many of the Jewish leadership that arose to try to separate themselves from the body of Israel. There is only one Israel, my friend, KLAL Israel, and no one has the right to say that they alone, absolutely in distinction to the others, is Israel. For more information, you could write to me, rabbiotero@yahoo.com. That's rabbiotero@yahoo.com. And look forward to receiving your email and your comments on this video. Keep in mind, there are many groups that we may not be individually in agreement with, but they are part of KLAL Israel. Be they Chabad, be they other Hasidic group, be they Sephardim, be they Ashkenaz. My friends, we're one KLAL Israel, not 100 multiple pieces, and each piece being separate to themselves. I wish you and yours Shabbat Shalom. B'racha u'mevarach.